Metroid's first installment on the NES was a very interesting experience. It's a game that kind of forces you back in time if you want to truly try to appreciate what it does, both the good and the bad. You need to steep yourself in the 80s gaming experience, you need to read manuals, you need to be able to chart your own course with literal pen and paper maps to fully engross yourself in the world, and you need to isolate yourself from all of the modern resources that can solve its myriad issues. It is a product of its time, so I can't be too hard on it because of that. No one had ever done anything like it before, and the fact that it manages to hold up as much as it does is a testament to how good of an idea the concept of Metroid was. And like any good concept, it was ripe for further exploration, and just 5 years after the original, we got our second entry in the Metroid series. 5 years may not seem like a long time. Nowadays, that's the difference between a game and a sequel that is barely any different from its predecessor, but back in the late 80s and early 90s, when gaming was still in its relative infancy, 5 years was an eternity. For instance, The Legend of Zelda released in 1986, and 5 years later, A Link to the Past came out. The amount of advancement the gaming industry had seen was incredible in such a short amount of time. Games that used to require bulky TV setups and home consoles now would get equivalent experiences on devices we could literally hold in our pockets and play whenever we wanted, as long as we had enough batteries. And this is basically how I started my gaming hobby. My parents bought me my Game Boy as a kid, and I have it to thank for my love of this medium. From Super Mario Land to Pokemon Yellow, from Donkey Kong 94 to The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, these games were basically my childhood, and they have a charm that speaks to me a lot more than the NES era's games do. And that's the power of nostalgia, right? But of course, as nostalgic as this system is to me, my exposure to the Game Boy's games wasn't as robust as I probably would have wanted. I only had so much time, and my parents were only so willing to spend money on these newfangled video game systems that rotted the brain and prevented me from getting the exercise that I desperately did and still do need. Metroid 2 Return of Samus is one of the games that I missed out on and never experienced during its original release period. Now that's not completely surprising or anything. I was literally 1 year old when it came out, so even if my parents would have been okay with buying me it, chances are it wouldn't have even been on store shelves by the time I was playing games. But unlike the NES original, Metroid 2 is a game that has simultaneously been a much bigger part of my life and a much smaller one. I have, up to this point, never beaten the Game Boy original of this game. Like, I bought it for the 3DS Virtual Console pretty shortly after it was released on it back in 2011, but only made it a short way into the game before basically forgetting about it, and that was my only experience with the Game Boy original. I don't even think I beat the first Metroid. But that's not to say I have no experience with Metroid 2 as an entity. I have played both Mercury Steam's remake Samus Returns and Dr. M64's fan remake AM2R, so I understand the broad strokes of Metroid 2, I just don't have very much experience with the specifics of the Game Boy original. I'm not going to be talking about either of these here. I think they probably both deserve their own unique looks, and moreover, I think the Game Boy original deserves that same treatment, so I'm going to be doing my best to ignore everything those games contributed to the experience of Metroid 2 as a whole, and really try to see what Metroid 2 Return of Samus is as its own thing. Now, this game has gained a bit of a reputation as being a black sheep in this franchise, a game that I myself described as being designed to be long-winded and repetitive 3 years ago, which is pretty harsh, especially since I hadn't actually beaten it, and I would like to give the game the chance that it deserves. Is it really like that, or is there more to it underneath the surface? Let's find out. And just before we get started here, if you like what I do and want to help out, like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you really want to go above and beyond, you can join my Patreon. You'll see these videos a week in advance, get exclusive updates, and even occasionally get an exclusive video. Alright, plug over. When you start up the game, there's really nothing to tell you what's going on here. No cutscenes, no text crawl giving you a broken English version of the story, nothing. So once again, let's dive into the manual to see what's up. After Samus successfully infiltrated the space pirate base, destroyed the Metroids they had obtained, and the Mother Brain, the Galactic Federation had to seriously consider their options in regards to the Metroids. First, they sent a research vessel to the Metroids' homeworld, SR-388, to make sure that there were no more of them left on the planet. After this research ship mysteriously went missing, special combat operatives operatives were sent to investigate, and they too disappeared without a trace. Having sent many people to their deaths, the Federation finally remembered that they suck and can't do anything right, so they once again contacted Samus Aran. The Federation is sure that the Metroids are still on SR-388 and are responsible for the disappearances of both their previous reconnaissance teams, so her mission here is very simple: to explore SR-388 and exterminate the Metroid species once and for all. Once on SR-388, Samus starts her mission, going right this time because there's seemingly nothing of note to the left of her ship. That's what we in the biz call foreshadowing. I think this is a clever bit of design that builds off the expectations built in the first game pretty well. NES Metroid's first lesson was that the obvious path isn't necessarily the right way to go, so knowing that, my first instinct was now to head to the left to see if there was anything of note there. But alas, there's nothing here. And just as an aside, we see Samus's ship for the first time here, and it's pretty much what I expected it to be, which is really cool. I don't know why I expected it to be different, somehow more generic, but it's the same old space Batmobile that Samus is known for. Anyways, I really like what this game did with its first area here. It's clearly a tutorial zone, but it does a great job of forcing players to engage with Samus's basic abilities right off the bat. The first corridor is nice and easy, just letting you get used to how Samus moves, jumps, and shoots. Nothing too special here, but as soon as you reach the first pit, you're forced to learn that Samus now has the ability to shoot down in mid-air. Once you reach the bottom, you'll find a small one-tile gap, which if you've played the first game, you'll recognize right away as a space for the morph ball. But when you press down on the D-pad to go into the morph ball, you'll see something else. Samus can crouch! There were a lot of things that made controlling Samus much more difficult and clunky than she could have been in that first game, and the fact that she was entirely unable to crouch was a big part of that. While yeah, I do understand that it was at least partially done to make the Morph Ball Bomb power-up more useful, it just didn't feel any good, and it made the experience of controlling Samus much less fun. This one addition, more than any other, makes Samus so much nicer to control here. Beyond that, Samus herself is just much more capable as a character from the get-go, and that does a ton to help with the feel of the experience. NES Samus was one of the weakest player characters I can remember. Her weapon was useless, she pretty much couldn't do anything except for running and jumping, and she started out with less than a third of her maximum HP. Now this was a conscious decision by the developers. They made Samus feel awful at the start, so once you did end up getting more power-ups and abilities, it would feel like those relatively paltry upgrades were far more significant than they would be to a more capable character. I don't think that angle particularly worked in its favor all that much, but it was a choice. Metroid 2 does things very differently, and Samus is significantly more formidable right from the start. The first thing you'll notice here is the UI, which shows Samus at a mighty 99 energy right away, which is a godsend, and she even starts with 30 missiles. That will be important very soon. She also has the ability to shoot the entire length of the screen right away, which isn't as impressive in such a small field of view, but hey, I appreciate it, and like I said earlier, she also starts with the Morph Ball. What's really cool about this, in my opinion, is that it shows a bit of narrative continuity between these two games. In Metroid, Samus started out with nothing, but over the course of her adventure, gained many of the abilities that she now starts with here in Metroid 2. It's not 100% lore accurate or anything. Samus would have at least the Ice Beam, Morph Ball Bombs, and 155 missiles if it were a direct continuity accurate sequel, but it does at least show a bit of continuity here, which was pretty rare in this time period. The Metroid series would lean pretty hard into this in the future, continuously finding new and occasionally interesting ways to lose all of the massively powerful abilities you rightfully gained in your previous adventures to start you off from scratch, but Samus's abilities were mostly rudimentary enough in that first game to make for a reasonable starting kit. Now I am ignoring the more modern timeline here. Things get really muddy when you realize that the entirety of the Prime series is supposed to happen in between Metroids 1 and 2. Actually, imagine if Metroid Prime ended with Samus getting all of her abilities drained, leaving her with nothing but her regular beam, Morph Ball, 30 missiles, and in order to go to SR-388. That would be so cool, but yeah, that sort of pipe dream ending wouldn't happen outside of a fan game. Anyways, Samus's actual power-ups are probably the least interesting part of her kit now. The ability to crouch and shoot, as well as shoot down while in the air, are massive capability boosts that make Samus feel far better to control overall. It felt like I was in control a lot more often here than I was in the first game. If I wanted to go somewhere, do something, or defeat any given enemy, I could pretty easily do it. Exploration in general is a far nicer nicer experience. Most importantly, her jumps feel way better to control now. While they are still pretty slow and floaty, they're simultaneously far more responsive than the NES game, which makes precise platforming far easier and way more fun. I think the fact that her spin jumps in particular have far less momentum on them makes all the difference. Samus felt slow and lumbering in that first game, like she was a big jug of water that you had to try to steer around in midair. But in Metroid 2, her jumps are snappy, responsive, and precise. It feels excellent, honestly a lot better than other Game Boy platformers I have a lot of experience with. Just moving around feels so much nicer too, although some of that may be thanks to the much better sprites and animations that Samus has now. Her animations feel like they have a lot more weight, which makes her slower, more floaty movement make more sense. I also really appreciate how the platform placement improves the platforming experience as a whole. Metroid's platform placement was really weird, like there was very little thought put into their arrangement, and that reflected in the platforming. It was awkward, difficult to deal with, and just not all that fun. But Metroid 2's platform placement is so much more deliberate and player-friendly. Platforms will be placed just high enough for Samus to reach with her normal jump, and after getting the high jump boots, she'll jump just high enough to reach a different set. It's just so much smoother. You can really tell that the player was at the forefront when building this game, and that elevates the entire experience a ton. If I were to have one small gripe, it's that Samus's aerial movement and grounded movement aren't the same speed. Samus's running speed is noticeably faster than her aerial speed, which does improve a lot of the platforming by allowing her jumps to be that much more precise, but I definitely felt that slowdown in comparison. If you've ever played Captain Falcon in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, it kind of feels like that, but to a much smaller degree. Momentum and inertia are important to making platformers feel good, you just have to be able to control it. The first game didn't nail that control aspect, and this one very slightly misses the momentum implementation. Ultimately, while I wish her speed was more consistent here, I think the benefits do outweigh the very slight game feel issue. Making our way further into this first area, if we were to head right at the bottom of this long vertical shaft, we'll see another new addition to Metroid thanks to the Game Boy's battery-powered cartridges, save stations. We'll get more into why these are so important in a little bit, but man, I was happy to see them. A bit beyond the save station, we see a pit of acid that we can't do anything about yet, so the only option is to head towards the left, and here's where the counter on the bottom right of the screen comes in. As the manual said, our mission here is to eliminate all the Metroids left on SR388, and the counter on the bottom right shows how many Metroids are left to find. At the start it's 39, and obviously as we find and defeat more of them, that counter will decrease. Heading to the left, we eventually track down our first Metroid, and we are met with an intriguing sight. Samus spots the Metroid, and right in front of our eyes, it seems to molt from its original form, becoming even more insectoid than it already was, then charges at Samus. This is the Alpha Metroid, the next stage in the Metroid species life cycle, and these are going to be the most common boss enemy we come across throughout the entire adventure. As bosses, they're kinda just there. Literally all they do is just move in Samus's direction in an attempt to damage her, but I do appreciate a few of the small details that were put into them. Mainly that after molting, they've lost their weakness to the ice beam, but in return have gained vulnerability to missiles on their own. I particularly like that these forms still take 5 missiles to destroy, just like their larval form. They may have evolved, but they aren't much stronger yet. Now I am kinda mixed on these designs, like they are cool, and the fact that we're witnessing the evolution of this species, how they progress from one life stage to another is really interesting, but as someone whose primary experience with the series is Metroid Prime, I am particularly fond of the Talon Metroid's phase-on mutated life cycles over these more, I guess, typical alien designs. Regardless, after defeating the Metroid, the counter drops to 38, and the planet seems to shake for a few seconds. I have no idea why killing a Metroid would cause geological events within the planet, but let's not think too hard about that right now. Returning to the right side of the area, we find that the acid that was previously blocking the way is now gone, allowing Samus to travel further and deeper into the planet's depths in search of more Metroids. And I think now is probably the best time to start talking about this game's map and structure, because it is very different from the originals, but I think it works really well, especially considering the platform it was made for. That first area we explored is basically a microcosm for the entire experience. Samus enters an area, explores around, and hunts down Metroids. Once she's taken out every Metroid in a given area, the ground shakes and the next one opens up, which offers new environments, new challenges, new item collectibles, and more Metroids. This setup does two things to the overall experience here that makes it feel really unique in comparison to the first game. First is that it effectively isolates each area area from one another, making each new area its own unique little Metroid experience. You can never progress into a later zone without eliminating every single Metroid in each one, so you're forced to take your time and explore each area more fully while tracking down the Metroids. The only indicator you have for your progress is the overall Metroid counter, so you won't even know when you've defeated everything until it's done. Because of this, I was much less likely to try to rush. If I knew I only had one Metroid left to defeat in a zone, I may have been less likely to traverse side paths and secret areas, but since you'll never know if what you find will be optional or mandatory, there's really no reason to consciously avoid anything. Many areas will even have their own progression that gives them their own sense of completion. For instance, Area 1, which is the very first one after the tutorial zone, has two mandatory collectibles, the Morph Ball Bomb and the newly added Spider Ball. We'll get into that later. And you need to explore, find secret areas, backtrack, and remember where you've been in order to progress through it and find all the Metroids after collecting both main items. These larger areas in particular do a great job of being mini Metroid games in their own right, and it's really satisfying to find the last Metroids in each one because of that. Second is that it transforms what was an incredibly open, often to a fault world in the NES game to a far more linear, guided tour through the depths of SR388. You're never tempted to wander too far off the beaten path, never in danger of being horrifically lost or overwhelmed by challenges you aren't prepared for because you basically can't get to any. While you can work your way back into previous areas if you wanted to go searching for items or power-ups you may have missed, you can never progress further into the game without completing your core goal in the current one. While I do see how some people could see that bit as a negative, I mean, I'd praise the first game for its openness and willingness to let you explore anything at your own pace, even to your own peril, but this approach has its own positives as well. Metroid on the NES did occasionally feel fairly aimless while exploring around. Like, the overall goals were fairly set in stone and obvious when you made progress towards them, but everything in between, especially thanks to the frequently copy and pasted areas and relative lack of meaningful rewards for exploring, gave lots of that exploration, especially in Norfair and Kraid's Lair, a feeling of meandering. So even if you were making progress and finding new things, it never actually felt like much was accomplished overall. Return of Samus's more linear, segmented approach to its level design focuses the experience a lot. By separating things into different areas and having them all access linearly one after another gives the game a constant momentum. You're always making progress, always pushing forwards, always getting closer and closer to your ultimate goal with every new area discovered. And the thing is, I think all of this was done specifically in service of the Game Boy's features and sensibilities. See, the Game Boy, being a handheld system, is functionally very different from a home console, and while we may take that sort of thing for granted nowadays, especially with the Switch being what it is and truly bridging the gap between the two philosophies, in the time of the original Game Boy, developers couldn't design games the same way that they could for home consoles, and Return of Samus's world design was built around not only what the Game Boy could do, but how people would be interacting with it. For starters, the more segmented level design works a lot better on a handheld system, because this is a game that, on original hardware at least, you can't really play for hours upon hours at a time without turning it off, and this thing doesn't have a sleep mode. Even if you had like 5 hours to play your Game Boy, there's no way it'd be able to last that long on a single set of batteries, at least not with the quality of batteries that I could afford back then. By segmenting the game out into discrete chunks, it lets the player make progress in the game as a whole while actually representing that progress in more concrete ways outside of Samus's upgrades. While it is a small reward, feeling the earth shake after defeating the last Metroid in an area, knowing that you've unlocked the path forward, is rewarding, and it's something that can be done in those necessarily shorter play sessions. Moreover, this world setup made navigating the map as a whole significantly easier. Having a map that you could write out yourself and reference to while playing Metroid on the NES was pretty much mandatory. It was so easy to get lost in the massive maze of nearly identical rooms that if you didn't have any sort of map to maintain your bearings, it'd be pretty much impossible to properly navigate, especially in Norfair. But in Return of Samus, because the zones are so much smaller and because the zones are so linearly set up, I never got meaningfully lost, and I never even bothered to bust out my pen and paper. Now, since I was playing on the Switch Online emulator from the comfort of my home, I did at least have that option if I so desired, but for people playing this game on the go back in 1991, that may have been impossible. I'm sure some people could have brought a pen and paper with them, but yeah, that would have been a minority of players, so obviously the game had to be designed to be much easier to navigate without that extra tool. Yeah, there are a few places you can get turned around in. Area 3 in particular has a few sections that are a bit of a pain to navigate through, but even so, those more hard to navigate rooms were typically short little detours, never interconnected with the main paths, and they pretty much always had save stations nearby. Speaking of save save stations, I was very happy to see them show up because thankfully we are beyond the point of password systems and no one will ever have to worry about them again. I honestly don't think this game would have worked at all if it had one. Imagine starting back at Samus's ship if you died in like Area 8. Gross. Heck, imagine if your batteries died before you could track down a pen to actually generate and write a password. Double gross. The save stations here work pretty much exactly as you'd expect them to. They keep track of everything you've done in your adventure, down to individual missile and energy numbers. I do kinda wish they would at least give an energy recharge as well, but I guess I'll take what I can get. My biggest real issue with the save stations is how awkwardly some of them are placed. There's a few that are pretty redundant, being placed really close to one another without any significant challenges in between them. This is a nitpick to be sure, but this is the sort of thing that bothers me way more than it has any right to, and I feel like spreading these save stations out a bit more would have improved the experience, if only a little bit. Now there is one other thing that the game did in service to the Game Boy's sensibilities, and that is its presentation. I love the Game Boy, but if there was one thing that genuinely did hold it back, it was its display. On top of it being incredibly small and dim, it was super limited in terms of colors, in that it couldn't really do them at all. It had a green tint to it, but that meant that all the colors you could see on it were some shade of green. And since the colors were so limited, developers had to be much more deliberate with their art design in order to get things across in a way that was easy to comprehend. Now, there are both Super Game Boy and Game Boy Color palettes for Metroid 2, which is pretty interesting, especially since the Game Boy Color palette only happened because the game's dev team was involved in the design of that system, but I obviously decided to stick with the original palette for this video. Actually seeing the limitations the team had to deal with when designing the game does a lot to help understand their intentions with their designs. And I really feel like the Metroid team rose to the challenge here particularly well, and manages to take something that I typically consider to be a bit of a negative in many Game Boy games and turns it into a strength. In order to properly convey what they needed to with their sprites, they made the important sprites like Samus, the Metroids, etc. very large. Samus's sprite is significantly larger than it was in the first game in raw pixel count, 40 high compared to the previous game's 32. This is a big change on its own, but considering the resolution of each system, Samus takes up about twice as much screen real estate as she used to, and in order to make everything else feel right, all the other sprites had to be scaled up as well, so we don't really get to see all that much of the world at any one time. It makes the game feel really claustrophobic, like there could be significant danger lurking just off screen and you'd never know it's even there until you're too close to get away. In a game like Super Mario Land 2, I feel like the larger sprites and restricted field of view is a bit of a negative. That's the sort of game that I need to see more of what's coming up so I can engage with the platforming challenges quickly and fluidly, but here I actually kinda like it. Metroid is already a slower, more methodical sort of experience. Rushing in without any care in the world can just get you killed, so this restricted field of view works pretty well to make me more cautious. Samus is diving deeper and deeper into the depths of an unknown planet, effectively spelunking down into cave systems that no one has been through in eons. Some level of caution and trepidation is warranted, and the sprites themselves are made with quite a bit more care than in the original game too. Take Samus for instance. Her sprite in that first game was really bad, weirdly proportioned, really poor coloring, pretty much no depth to it at all, the works. Despite the fact that this new sprite has no color to it at all, it pops so much more in comparison. The design is clearer and more intricate, and the proportions are way better, albeit not perfect. Excluding the ending sprites of course, those are amazing. The sound design works to elevate the claustrophobic feeling a ton too. On the surface and in early areas, you're met with this theme that is pretty upbeat, adventurous, and kind of poppy even. But that cheery feeling doesn't last, and quickly changes focus to be intent on creating a strong atmosphere, which is something the first game also did really well. By the time we reach the deeper caverns, the music is effectively replaced with ambience. The sounds here are not working at all to create any sort of melody, instead doing an incredible job at making this world feel more real. The music of these later areas almost feels like it's trying to recreate the sounds you'd hear when out walking in the wilderness. There's no rhyme or reason to it, no theme tying it all together, it's just the sounds of nature, animals communicating, flora being disturbed by the wind, that sort of thing. Return of Samus is able to capture some of the strongest atmosphere in the series thanks in part to this sound design philosophy, but we'll get more into that when we get there. With all that out of the way, let's actually get back into the game and start taking out Metroids. Making our way into Area 1, we find the Morph Ball bombs and Spider Ball, as I said earlier. I think the Spider Ball is a particularly interesting little ability since it helps facilitate a much more vertical, denser level design. Once you get it, you'll be able to scale pretty much every wall in the game, so the team had to make sure to fill many of these spaces with important things to find, collectibles, health refills, and of course, Metroids. I also think the Spider Ball was a great way to basically force people to find secrets. Unlike the first game where the majority of hidden pathways and secret rooms were hidden behind destructible blocks, more often than not in Return of Samus, the secret passageways will literally be just out in the open and accessible, but invisible. Like, I'd just be minding my own business, climbing the walls like a good Spider-Man, when I'd suddenly find myself in a hidden passage to somewhere new that I didn't even expect. The secrets in general here are so much better than they were in the first game too. Due to the copy and paste nature of Metroid, a huge number of its secrets were just the same secrets used multiple times, and it made the experience of discovering them pretty underwhelming. With Metroid 2, secrets are so much more cleverly placed. There's loads of unique hiding places for items, even some special challenges to find collectibles, and I really appreciate that a lot. It made exploring and finding things so much more fun and made me so much more eager to keep playing. That being said, Return of Samus isn't immune to the copy and paste areas, but they're much more limited, sequestered to specific parts of the maps, and pretty much never placed in close proximity to each other. Typically, the ceilings of larger areas will have the same secret blocks, even if they don't contain anything, but I'm willing to forgive that a lot more this time around, because they are a significant minority in comparison to the cool stuff. Before moving into Area 2, I want to talk about energy tanks. We find our first one in Area 1, and it does exactly what you'd expect it to, which is increase Samus's energy by 100. These were one of the most interesting design choices in the first game, but their function in terms of the overall experience has changed and now resembles their current implementation a lot more. That is because Return of Samus introduces energy and missile recharge stations which, when interacted with, will completely fill Samus's energy or missiles respectively. This reduces energy tanks to simply being a max HP increase, which does make them a little less interesting as items, but drastically improves the playability of the game as a whole. Like the first game, there are more energy tanks than you need though, which kind of cements my theory that the extras weren't intended as single-use refills in that first game, and were just included to make sure you had max health before entering the endgame. Anyways, Area 2 is when I really started to notice something really interesting about SR388. In the manual of the first Metroid, it mentioned the fact that the Metroids wiped out the existing civilization of SR388, and while it was pretty clear in Area 1, it really started to hit here. Area 2 is built around a massive artificial structure. There's several rooms, artificial waterways, pipes to crawl through, and robots defending the ruins, still performing their duties long after their makers were wiped out. I particularly like how the area design implies that nature has started to take back what was once fully developed. While Area 3 shows more of the architectural decay, Area 2 shows how the wildlife is reacting to the Chozo's absence. For instance, I came across this Chozo statue that wasn't holding anything, and once I worked my way into a hidden room behind it, it seemed like the local wildlife had been gathering similar things, overlaying eggs that looked like item spheres. At the very bottom of the pile, I found a Chozo item sphere containing the Variasuit. Another example is this Chozo statue, where a creature named Arachnus had made its home. Defeating it awards Samus the Spring Ball, and I really love what they do with the Spring Ball here. The Spider Ball is a great ability, but its use was somewhat limited in a sense. You had to work your way to the nearest wall in order to roll your way up, and that occasionally wasted a good amount of time, as well as limited what areas you can actually climb. The Spring Ball rounds out the Spider Ball's abilities really well by letting you latch onto walls and ceilings after jumping with the Spring Ball. There's one more thing that Area 2 introduces, and it's found deep within the caves. We saw the Metroids first molt from their larval form into their alpha form, and here we get to see what happens next. Gamma Metroids are much tougher than their alpha counterparts, but their battles are still fairly similar overall. They'll still charge towards Samus, but rather than just trying to ram her, they'll spew electric attacks that do a decent amount of damage to her. That being said, these fights aren't too difficult, they just take more missiles to take down than an alpha would. They get pretty annoying depending on what arena you have to fight them in, but I typically enjoyed the extra challenge they offered. Area 3 introduces a bunch of new items, Space Jump, Spazer, and the Plasma Beam, and I'm really starting to be surprised surprised at the amount of important things that this game introduced in particular. I honestly thought that most of this stuff debuted in Super, so I was pretty pleasantly surprised to see most of it show up here. Much like the first game, Return of Samus ends up feeling very forward-thinking in its game design, and Samus ends up feeling very powerful very quickly. You might think that the space jump may end up completely invalidating the spider ball, but honestly not really, at least in my experience. Space jump is really awkward to control, and I often ended up defaulting to spider ball because of how consistent it was in comparison, even if it is a bit slower. The next major event happens in Area 6, where we see what Gamma Metroids evolve into. Zeta Metroids. These are probably my least favorite Metroids to fight. They'll fly around Samus, keeping their distance at all times, then quickly ram into her when you don't expect it. They're a much more interesting fight than anything else we've seen in the franchise so far, so I do appreciate that, but man, they are annoying. Overall, Area 6 is pretty cool because it gives the screw attack, which combined with the space jump turns Samus into a flying Beyblade of Doom, and I love it. This area also gives us a bevy of beam options. Much like the first game, beams don't stack, and you can only have one of them at a time, but since the Metroids aren't really weak to Ice Beam anymore, which one you go with is really just a personal choice. I'm a Ride or Die Plasma stan, so I went with that, but you can go with Ice, Wave, or Spazer as well, and I appreciate the options. Now, I haven't talked much about every single area so far because some of these are, for all intents and purposes, transitionary areas to move you from one larger hub to another. Areas 4, 5, and 7 don't really have all that much interesting to talk about thanks to this. That being said, I'm still happy they're here. They're a good change of pace and throttle up the atmosphere, really helping sell the idea that you're traveling deeper and deeper within the cave systems of SR388. Speaking of atmosphere, Area 8 is amazing. It's objectively one of the smallest areas, but what it does is really thrilling. Upon entering, it didn't seem that special. I made my way up to the top, where an Alpha Metroid resided. Big deal, 5 missiles, kaboom. I defeat it, the ground shakes, and I think I'm good to go. But wait, defeating the Metroid raised the acid? And wait, weren't there 2 Metroid husks in that top section? Oh no. Making my way back around, I was faced with the most powerful of the Metroid variants, the Omega Metroid. As a fight, it's really not any different from the Zetas, but obviously it's much stronger and takes a lot more to defeat. It is large and imposing, at least. As much as I wish the fight itself was a bit more interesting, their introduction was amazing, easily one of the best moments in the game. Moving on from that, I started to notice something else, something that's a lot more subtle but is excellent environmental storytelling. The Metroids are energy vampires, capable of wiping out entire civilizations, so they'll obviously be making their mark on the natural environment around them as well. Moving into Area 9, where the Omegas have set up shop, really shows how destructive they can be. Earlier areas were full of life, loads of different creatures living their lives, defending their habitats from intruders like Samus. But here, there's nothing left. The only living beings left are the strongest animals SR388 has to offer, and ones that can hide themselves from the Metroids, clinging to cave walls, being effectively invisible. Most other creatures have been wiped out, made meals for the Metroids. But that's all the more reason to keep going and take them out before all life on SR388 is eradicated, and since there's only 4 Metroids left, we're in the homestretch. After defeating all 3 Omega Metroids living in Area 9, the counter drops to 1, and we head down into Area 10, the final zone, in order to take out the final Metroid. There really isn't a lot here, except for some energy recharge stations and a broken Chozo statue giving us the Ice Beam. I wonder why that's there. That couldn't be important, right? All charged up, Samus moves into the next part of the area, and her Metroid counter goes crazy, shooting all the way back up to 9. More Metroids are being born, and Samus clearly has to stop the source in order to put all of this to an end. She heads further in, defeating larval Metroids as she comes across them, exactly the same way they were defeated in the first game, and eventually reaches an endpoint. Dropping down into the pit, Samus is confronted by the largest and most dangerous of all Metroids, the Metroid Queen. Now this is a boss fight, like by far the best the series has to offer up to this point. The Metroid Queen is really tough, does loads of damage, and if you don't know how to beat her, she can really easily wipe the floor with you. Thankfully, if you're in danger of death, you can easily drop down into this hole back to the broken statue to let you regroup. The Metroid Queen takes hundreds of missiles to destroy on her own, and you need to constantly dodge her projectiles as well as her bites. But if you're paying attention, you'll see that she occasionally freezes when you shoot missiles into her mouth while it's open, and this is a hint as to how you can defeat her a lot quicker. By noticing this and quickly going into Morph Ball while she's frozen, you can roll your way into her gut and lay Morph Ball bombs. These do loads of damage to her, equivalent to dozens upon dozens of missiles, taking the fight from an incredibly dangerous war of attrition to a manageable challenge. Eventually, the Queen does go down and the counter finally drops to 0. And with that, the Metroid Scourge is finally defeated. Once and for all, I'm sure. In the room after the Queen, we come across arguably the most important moment in the entire Metroid series. Samus comes across an egg which hatches into a baby Metroid that immediately shows some affection towards Samus. Now, for better or worse, this series will dive fairly deep into the themes of motherhood and the bonds between parent and child, and I feel like this is an incredible way to start that exploration. The baby Metroid isn't hostile towards Samus at all, it only seems to want to consume these diamond things on the ground, and it's intent on following her around. Now, I did notice that the Metroid counter didn't increase to 1 when the baby hatched, and I'm kind of mixed on this decision. On one hand, it not showing up on the counter does imply that it's different, that it's not going to be like those other Metroids and thus doesn't need to be exterminated, but I honestly think it would have been a stronger narrative beat to do it differently. It's pretty obvious that this hatchling is different from the other Metroids just by its behavior towards Samus. I think that if the counter went back up to 1 and everything else from the ending played out the same, it would be a much stronger show of character for Samus, knowing that she's purposely defying the mission in order to save the life of an innocent creature. That being said, it's really all up to personal preference and interpretation. I wouldn't be at all surprised if people thought differently. Anyways, this ending section is very well done. It's a complete 180 from the ending of the first game. Whereas that ending had a strict time limit, you had no time to even think about what had happened and needed to escape ASAP, Metroid 2's ending is purposefully very slow, very introspective. You're supposed to reflect on what you've done here, the lives you took, the lives you've likely saved, and the new bond forged with what was supposed to be your ultimate enemy. There's nothing to fight here, no puzzles to solve, it's just Samus and the Metroid making their way back up to the surface so they can leave SR388 in peace. It's a really powerful scene and an incredibly bold decision by the developers. This sort of thing takes a lot of confidence. The ending of a game is incredibly important to a person's opinions on the overall experience, so purposefully stripping things down like this is a bit of a risk, but in my opinion, it's one that pays off in spades. Once Samus and the baby Metroid reach the surface, they head to the right, where upon falling down the cliff, conveniently find themselves right back at Samus's ship, and once Samus enters it, the game ends with the last Metroid in captivity. And that was Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Honestly, I loved this game. I was a little worried going into it since it had a reputation as one of the weaker entries in the series, but honestly, it exceeded my expectations in every aspect. Pretty much everything is leagues better than it was in that first game. Exploration is more fun because the environments are significantly more unique, more expansive, and offer way more in terms of secrets and collectibles to find. Combat is way better thanks to both Samus being a much more capable character, giving her many more options in that combat, as well as the design of enemies and bosses being significantly more interesting, complex, and fun. And don't even get me started on the storytelling. The way it handles its environmental storytelling is frankly revolutionary. It's able to express so much about the history of this world, the people that live there, the wildlife that call it home, and what the Metroid's existence has done to affect all of that with so much finesse through gameplay that it comes across as effortless. It honestly makes me question how this game got its reputation as being one of the weaker titles in the first place. It must have happened in retrospect, right? People like me, going back to this series after experiencing everything that came after it with the standards that had been set by those later games, that sort of thing. That's not a call out on the fans or anything, it is admittedly really hard to give a game like this a chance to stand on its own without that later context. But it isn't Return of Samus's fault that the Metroid series would see even greater heights in the years beyond it. As it is, as the second game in this series, it's an extremely polished, fun experience that surpasses its predecessor in basically every conceivable way. If I had been around in the late 80s and early 90s and had played both of these games back to back, I'd have been blown away by Return of Samus, especially since it was able to do all of this and be so much better than that first game on a handheld system. I'd have thought there was no way Nintendo could have ever topped this, but come on. I know what's next, you know what's next, and what's next is often lauded as not only one of Nintendo's best games, but one of the greatest games ever made. So next time we'll be diving back into the depths of Planet Zebes to thwart the space pirates once more in one of the most influential and important titles Nintendo has ever released, Super Metroid. Thank you all so much for watching. And just before I end the video, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Louis G, Adora Sharp, James Fish, Lucky Wonderfish, Creeping Briar, Matthew Lorigan, Dom, Benjamin Illiff, Anthony, and Prometheus. You're all the best. Thank you so much.